Hi, Mrs. Fernandi here to read the very end of Chasing Vermeer. And before we start this chapter, I just wanted to share the screen and show one more time the beautiful lady that all this fuss is being made about. And I looked for a little bit better rendition because I feel like our last one was a little fuzzy. This one is also a little fuzzy, but a little bit better. You can see that I don't know. She's pretty special. She has all kinds of beautiful things going on, and this picture is just gorgeous. So I just wanted to remind you that that's what we're talking about. And then this number 12 that keeps coming up, that Petra and Calder are both turning 12, and that there are 12 pentominoes, and it's about to be the 12th day of the 12th month. So lots of fun patterns and things going on in this book. Okay, are you ready? She's just discovered poor Calder up in the treehouse, clutching a package. Chapter 24, The Pieces. Old Fred had been found dead on the train in the early hours of the morning, having suffered a massive heart attack. He was wearing boots that matched the prints around the base of the Castiglione's treehouse. Although Fred's beard was gone and his glasses were different, Calder had recognized his voice. Fred had knocked him off the slide, and Calder had hit his head in the fall. He then pretended to be unconscious. When it looked like Fred was gone, Calder got to his feet. His head was pounding, he was dizzy, and there was no sign of Petra. He hoped with all his heart that she had gotten help before Fred caught up with her. Calder started for home, moving unsteadily through backyards. He was just resting in the bushes when Fred ran by carrying the lady. Calder followed. Hiding behind bushes, he watched Fred climb up to the Castiglione's treehouse with the painting. When he heard the loud crack of a tree branch and saw Fred scramble up onto the tracks, he felt there was no time to go get official help. He had to get the lady down. Fred might be sending someone back within minutes to retrieve her. Calder staggered across the Castiglione's backyard, tried to step carefully in Fred's footsteps so as not to leave a trail, and climbed the tree. When he reached the platform and saw that the painting was safe, he stopped to rest. That was when he passed out. Shortly after, Petra found him, possibly saving his life. He had a nasty concussion, but recovered enough to have birthday cake the next day with his friend. Petra reminded him that they were now even. He had probably saved her life by distracting old Fred while she ran with the painting. Fred Stedman's name, it turned out, was Xavier Glitz. He was the leader of an international crime ring. The FBI discovered that Glitz had advanced degrees from the Sorbonne in Paris and from Princeton University. His nickname in the world of art theft was Glitter Man. He was famous for changing identities and for charming his way in and out of impossible situations. In addition to his New York home, he had an apartment in London and one in Rome. All of his files on the theft of a lady waiting turned up in a bank vault in Switzerland. Xavier Glitz had a customer who had wanted for many years to own this particular Vermeer masterpiece. The collector, a clever criminal himself, would pay Glitz $60 million for her, but wanted a guarantee that the police would never trace the theft. Glitterman had come up with what he thought was a brilliant plan. He would pose as an idealistic thief. He picked Hyde Park as the perfect community in which to hide, and the role of Zelda Zagovia's husband as a perfect disguise. Shortly after he and Zelda were married, they attended a fundraising dinner at the university school. There, he chatted with a young teacher named Isabel Hussey, who had just been hired to teach at the school in the fall. Discovering that she had been trained by an art historian, he drew her into a discussion about Vermeer, pretending to be ignorant himself about the painter's work. Miss Hussey gave him all the ideas about attribution that went into the thief's letters. At the University of Chicago's archives, Xavier Glitz gained the trust of one of the research librarians who told him about a secret compartment in Delia Dell Hall, a compartment that was supposedly under the main staircase. Glitz had explained to the librarian that he was documenting secret storage places in the greatest universities in the world, and claimed that he had heard of several at Oxford, at Harvard, at McGill, and at the University of Salamanca. The librarian at the University of Chicago was happy to tell him all she knew. While living on Harper Street, Glitz heard about his reclusive neighbor, Louise Sharp. and soon found out she was Leland Sharp's widow. She, like Miss Hussey, had passionate feelings about Vermeer's work. It was almost too good to be true. And then Glitz met Vincent Watch at Powell's. They chatted, and Mr. Watch mentioned that his two great loves were art books and mysteries, and that he hoped one day to write an art mystery that focused on real issues in the art world. He had never gotten round to writing such a book, but had dreamed about it for years. Glitz had nodded sympathetically. According to a journal found by the FBI in Glitz's bank vault, he came up with the idea of the three letters in order to confuse the authorities and to create three suspects. Then he had fun writing the letters that were published by newspapers and watching the public's reaction. His theft had been a one-of-a-kind world event, and he was a hero to thousands of people. He was only sorry that no one would ever know he was responsible. After writing the letter in which he threatened to burn the painting, and which he said he was old and would not live long, hoping obviously to sound like Mrs. Sharp, Glitz had planned to remove a lady writing from the secret compartment, deliver it for his $60 million, and allow the world to believe it had been burned. He was quite sure that no museum would meet the demands in his last letter. The FBI speculated that on the night he returned to Delia Del Hall to get the painting, he had just parked his car when he heard the building alarm go off, and then saw Calder and Petra running. That was where things started to go wrong. In their investigations, the FBI found that Mrs. Sharp had a great deal of money and that she had made a generous gift to the National Gallery after the theft had taken place. She explained in a steely tone that she had wanted to remain anonymous, disliking publicity after the circumstances of her husband's death. She had intended the money to pay for gatherings of Vermeer scholars to work on attribution and on the crime. When the money was used to pay for the Vermeer dilemma, she was surprised but could hardly complain, given her request. Miss Hussey was horrified when she heard from Mrs. Sharp about everything Calder and Petra had done to protect her. Never having lived in a big city, she had been lonely and homesick that fall. She had received a strange letter. When the painting was stolen and she realized that her ideas about Vermeer's work sounded like the thief's, she had been frightened. Trying to figure out what to do with the thief's letter had been the final straw. She had no one to talk to in Chicago, no one, that is, but her 6th grade class. Zelda Zagovia was horrified that she'd been charmed into marrying a professional criminal. She knew nothing about Xavier Glitz or his shady business. When Tommy found out that his stepfather's real name was Glitterman, he snorted. More like Twitter, man. I never heard so much gabbing in all my life. The way he promised stuff and then figured out how to take it away. What a sneak. So he was Tommy's stepdad. Frank Andeli had felt terrible about having frightened Petra that day in Delia Del Hall. He had been delivering an old print from one of the science labs to the guy with the big eyebrows, who was a publicity man working for the university. Petra's dad changed departments that winter and was much happier with his new job. Vincent Watch had carried the letter around with him for weeks, getting a secret thrill from knowing it was in his pocket. He didn't want to contact the police before he was sure the thief wasn't going to contact him with an interesting proposal that he could then use for his book. The letter would be a good way to begin an art mystery. When the news came out about Mrs. Sharp and Miss Hussey being the other two recipients, he decided to confide in Mrs. Sharp. He knew she wouldn't talk and would give him sound advice about whether to call the police. After Calder's last delivery to Mrs. Sharp, Mr. Watch stopped by her house on the way home from work. When he reached into his pocket to show Mrs. Sharp the letter, it was gone. He never understood how this had happened. He must have missed his pocket the last time he slid the letter back in, and it must have fallen out on his walk down Harper Avenue. He was extremely upset, but Mrs. Sharp was sympathetic and practical. They agreed that it no longer made sense for him to tell the authorities about the third letter. Since he had no proof of having gotten it, he just looked silly. This, strangely, was the second time he'd lost the letter. He'd made a copy weeks earlier in case he lost the original, and it had somehow gotten away from him between the copy store and Powell's. It was almost eerie. This was the letter Petra saw blowing around, but as Mr. Watch hadn't told Mrs. Sharp about it, Petra never knew where it came from. She told Mrs. Sharp about finding the third letter tucked neatly into the bushes. They agreed it was a chain of events that would have intrigued Charles Fort. As soon as the FBI had finished their questioning, Mrs. Sharp, Calder, and Petra got together again for tea in Mrs. Sharp's kitchen. This time, the tulips were yellow. Mrs. Sharp congratulated the children on their extraordinary bravery and intelligence. Coming from her, this was quite a compliment. After tea, Calder filled in Mrs. Sharp on all the patterns of 12 he had identified. He told her about his pentomino seeming to give him messages. He explained that he was quite sure there were more 12s involved. Mrs. Sharp's eyes became slits, as they had in the hospital when Petra had talked about her dream. The old woman was very quiet. They told her about the monkey panel finds flute finds moment on the stair in Delia Dell. They asked her if she had done that on purpose. I wish, she said, giving them a smile that was almost wistful. She thanked them both for sharing such fabulous secrets and promised she would never tell those secrets to another soul, not without their permission. Somehow, Calder and Petra knew they could trust her. Then she offered a secret of her own and asked them both to keep it until after her death. Both agreed immediately, and Petra reached out to pat Mrs. Sharp's bony hand. Mrs. Sharp went over some of what Calder and Petra had already heard about her past. She said that just before her husband Leland had been murdered, she had received a letter from him saying he had made a stunning discovery about Vermeer's paintings, a discovery that would shake art historians all over the world. He couldn't wait to tell her about it, but wanted to save the news until he was safe and sound in Hyde Park. And then, on the day he was due to fly back to Chicago, his body was found outside the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. He had been killed by a blow to the head. His date book had been in his suitcase, which was in the hotel lobby. When Mrs. Sharp looked in the date book weeks later, she saw 1212 scribbled hurriedly in his handwriting on the day of his death. She pointed this out to the police, but no one knew what to make of it. Did it mean 12 minutes past noon or midnight? Did it represent the number 1212? She wasn't able to figure it out either. The police never brought anyone to trial, and the mystery had faded over time. After telling the children this story, Mrs. Sharp sat quietly for a moment, looking down at the table. Then she blinked rapidly, sat up straight, and blew her nose. She continued in her familiar businesslike tone. I became determined to pick up where Leland had left off, but I never could figure out exactly what it was he had uncovered or realized. In the years since, I've studied everything I could about Vermeer. I vowed that I would support any new research on his life or his paintings. And then, last fall, something very odd began to happen to me. And this is the part I want you to keep a secret. Mrs. Sharp said that she had been told by the woman in A Lady Writing to clear the name of Vermeer, to make sure that the world knew that a number of his works had been done by followers. She had received pages and pages of messages, words she said she had merely written down. Calder and Petra looked at each other as Mrs. Sharp disappeared to get a sheet of paper from the pile next to her computer. She settled back down at the kitchen table. This is what she read. My lie is that I am only canvas and pigment. My truth is that I am alive. Some might call this your imagination, but it's not. Art, as you know, is about ideas. I am as real as your blue china or the boy with the box or the girl who dreamed about me. I am very much here. Can we just stop there? Thanks.